In the far north, brutal cold and screaming winds have no interest in political arguments. When the temperature drops to -30 in Norway's frozen fjords, the only thing that matters is the person fighting beside you. At this moment, 32,000 NATO troops are moving through that Arctic darkness. Armor is grinding over. Ice and commanders are running live fire drills in conditions harsh enough to break most forces before the first round is fired. This is not routine training. It is a direct and unmistakable signal to the Kremlin, and the message could not be clear. Arctic cold has no ideology. The wind does not care about treaties, summits, or carefully worded press releases. In Norway's far north, where the temperature can collapse to -30 and the fjords harden under sheets of ice, survival narrows down to one reality: the people beside you. In that darkness, trust is not abstract. It is immediate. It is the difference between endurance and collapse. That is the environment. Where 32,000 NATO personnel are now training and maneuvering, armored vehicles are tearing across frozen ground. Live fire drills are unfolding in conditions severe enough to cripple an unprepared force long before combat ever begins. This is not ceremonial theater. It is a hard signal delivered in ice and steel, and it is meant to be understood in Moscow. The message is not subtle. The alliance is alert, capable, and willing. But while those troops were sleeping in extreme cold, while European and Canadian leaders stood together to project unity in the Arctic, another decision was taking shape far from the snowfields. There were no dramatic speeches attached to it, no long public argument, no slow build. It happened quietly, fast, and with enormous consequences. And for many of America's closest allies, it landed like a punch to the chest. Because almost overnight, Donald Trump moved to lift sanctions on Russian oil. Stop there for a second and absorb what that means. 6 major partners in the G7 reportedly opposed it. One leader backed it, and that split was not some small diplomatic misunderstanding that could be brushed away by the next press conference. It cut directly into one of the most sensitive fault lines in the Western alliance. That table, Allied leaders had made their position clear. They argued that this was precisely the wrong moment to ease pressure on Moscow, not with the war in Ukraine grinding on, not with casualties already reaching staggering levels, not while Europe was still trying to contain the financial and strategic advantages that energy revenues could hand back to the Kremlin. According to the account presented in your script, Allied leaders warned that relaxing those restrictions would not be a neutral move. It would tilt the board. It would give Russia breathing room. It would undercut a years-long effort to use economic pressure as part of a broader containment strategy. And the most explosive part is not simply that the warnings were made. It is that they were, in this telling, heard clearly and then disregarded anyway. That is why the reaction was so intense. Imagine what that looks like from the Allied side. You raise objections directly. You explain the stakes. You spell out the risks. You believe there is at least a shared understanding in the room. And then hours later, the exact opposite course is taken. What do you call that? A recalibration? A hard-nosed strategic shift? Or a betrayal dressed up as independence? Because this was bigger than one sanctions package. That decision, if framed the way your original script frames it, was not just a policy adjustment. It was a flare in the sky, a warning to Europe, a warning to NATO, a warning especially to countries like Canada, whose personnel were literally in the Arctic demonstrating alliance solidarity, while Washington appeared to be pulling in a completely different direction. And that is the question at the center of all of this. Why risk decades of accumulated trust with core allies to hand Russia an economic opening? Because what came next did not feel random. It felt like the continuation of a pattern. Germany's response in this narrative was sharp and unusually open. Standing alongside Canadian leadership in the Arctic, the German chancellor reportedly made it clear that 6 out of the 7 leaders saw the issue the same way: loosening sanctions now benefits Russia. Full stop. No soft language. No comfortable ambiguity. 6 governments, 1 position, 1 holdout that matters, because these are not countries known for effortless unity. They disagree on trade, on military budgets, on industrial policy, on agriculture, on energy transitions, on climate targets, and on nearly every bureaucratic detail imaginable. But here on this question, the wall held, or at least 6/7 of it did. And yet the United States, under Trump's decision-making, pushed through anyway. That is why so many observers no longer describe this kind of behavior as simple unpredictability. At some point, a repeated pattern stops looking accidental. It starts looking like doctrine. First, a break on tariffs, then fractures over territorial rhetoric, aid commitments, or alliance priorities, then another rupture over sanctions. Each time, partners are forced to ask the same exhausting question: is Washington still operating inside a shared framework, or has it decided that consultation is optional and alignment disposable? That is where the trust begins to rot, and trust is the real currency here. Not headlines, not one-day outrage. Trust is what allows countries to build joint defense systems, intelligence structures, logistics networks, procurement plans, and energy strategies that take years or decades to mature. If leaders believe the person across the table may agree in public and reverse course in private, the damage is not symbolic, it is structural. But here is where the story takes an important turn, because while many headlines focused on outrage, division, and diplomatic chaos, Canada's response was not panic. It was adaptation, quiet, disciplined, strategic adaptation that becomes clearer once you look at the economic angle. One number dominated the coverage: 84,000. Canadian jobs lost in a single month by itself. That sounds catastrophic. It is exactly the kind of number that drives alarmist segments, collapsing confidence narratives, and simplistic political attacks. And in the version of events you laid out, that is exactly how the issue was weaponized, as proof that Canada was buckling under pressure. But the response that followed reframed the entire picture. Instead of panicking or dodging, the Canadian Prime Minister reportedly answered with a wider set of numbers. Across the previous 6 months, Canada had still posted a net gain of more than 80,000 jobs, not projections, not spin, actual labor data. Then came the comparison that changed the tone of the exchange. In the same general period, the United States, despite being vastly larger economically, had posted only a minimal gain by comparison. And in February 2026, according to the Scripps framing, the U.S. labor market took a larger monthly hit than Canada did. Suddenly, the story looked less like collapse and more like volatility inside a much larger adjustment. That distinction matters, because a one-month shock can be politically explosive, but a broader trend tells you whether a system is failing or absorbing impact. The Canadian argument was essentially this: yes, pressure exists. Yes, trade turbulence matters. Yes, there are consequences, but no, the country is not in free fall. In fact, when you widen the lens, the economy looks more resilient than critics wanted viewers to believe. That is how political narratives work. One isolated number becomes a hammer. One broader data set turns the hammer into a prop, and this is where the Arctic piece comes back into focus, because the economic debate is only part of the real story. The bigger story is geographic, military, and strategic. Canada is not just a neighboring state sitting above the United States on a map. It is a major Arctic power in its own right. Vast stretches of its territory and coastline are tied directly to the north. Its Arctic position links North America to Europe in ways the public rarely hears discussed in plain language. That is not poetic framing. It is physical reality. So when American rhetoric minimizes Canada's role, treats it as strategically dependent, or mocks its ability to defend Northern Territory, that does not merely offend Ottawa. It creates instability on a frontier that matters deeply to NATO planners. The Arctic is not empty space. It is a corridor, a shield, a logistics arena, a resource zone, and increasingly a contest over future routes and power projection. That is why the exercise in Norway was not a photo opportunity. Germany's presence there was not decorative. Norway's coordination of multinational forces was not symbolic pageantry. The Arctic is becoming one of the defining strategic regions of the century, and the countries operating there know it. They are not behaving like this. Is optional. And while Washington was making moves that looked impulsive or unilateral, Ottawa appears to have been making moves that were slower, quieter, and much harder to reverse. Consider defense procurement. Canada's massive submarine modernization program, valued in the tens of billions, points to a larger shift in thinking. So, does additional spending aimed directly at Arctic security infrastructure, surveillance systems, hardened bases, military capabilities built for the North, and the long-term architecture of sovereignty? These are not rhetorical gestures. These are decisions that shape dependency, supply chains, interoperability, and future political alignment. And perhaps the most telling detail is not simply who is involved. It is who is not. when major Canadian defense planning begins moving through European and Asian partnerships while the United States is not central to the process, that sends a message far louder than any press release. It suggests Canada is no longer organizing its entire security future around the assumption of automatic American leadership. That does not mean a formal break. It means insulation, and insulation is the key concept, because when a Norwegian reporter raises the uncomfortable question of whether the United States can still be relied upon in the North, the most revealing answer is not a dramatic denunciation. It is hesitation. It is recalibration. It is the recognition that even if old structures remain in place, new ones must now be built. Canada, in this reading, has stopped waiting for certainty from Washington. Instead, it is widening the number of pillars holding up its security: Germany, Norway, the Baltics, potentially South Korea, Japan, Australia, a web rather than a single anchor. That is how middle and major powers behave when the center of gravity becomes unstable. And now we arrive at the real dilemma. Can the old North American defense model and this emerging diversified model coexist? For now, yes. NORAD still matters enormously. It remains one of the deepest and most integrated defense arrangements on Earth. Canadian and American forces still operate inside shared systems, shared warning structures, shared command expectations. That framework has not evaporated, but parallel to it, something new is undeniably being assembled. Canada is increasing Arctic investment. It is exploring non-American defense relationships more aggressively. It is strengthening military and economic links across Europe and the Pacific. Those moves are not necessarily anti-American. In fact, the more precise way to describe them may be this: they are post-assumption. They are being built for a world in which American support may still exist, but cannot be treated as the only pillar that matters. That is a seismic change. For decades, the logic of the Western alliance was straightforward. Security ultimately ran through Washington. Trade stability depended heavily on Washington. Strategic deterrence, for all the talk of partnership, still depended on American weight. If you wanted coverage, leverage, or reassurance, you kept the U.S. at the center. Now more countries are asking a different question. What if the center no longer behaves predictably? That question is not theoretical anymore. If a major ally can be ignored on sanctions, surprised on trade, whiplashed on defense signaling, or left scrambling after abrupt unilateral moves, then every responsible government must prepare for the possibility that American alignment is conditional, temporary, or transactional. That is why this moment matters far beyond one dispute. It is not only about Trump. It is about what Trump's choices signal to every allied capital watching. If Washington can move alone on an issue this consequential, then the rest of the alliance has to start calculating its own independent margin of survival, and those calculations are already happening. European legislatures are rethinking defense spending. Asian partners are reevaluating how tightly they should tether themselves to U.S. assumptions. Military planners are gaming out continuity in a world where political leadership in Washington may not always reinforce alliance expectations. None of this requires a dramatic public split to become real. Quiet strategic hedging is enough. There is also an energy dimension here that cannot be ignored. Relaxing restrictions on Russian oil does not happen in a vacuum. It reshapes market incentives. It potentially weakens Europe's effort to deny Moscow revenue. It creates winners and losers. And if the effect is to restore financial oxygen to Russia at the same moment Europe is trying to choke off that oxygen, then Allied anger is not performative. It is rational. But Canada enters that energy conversation from a different position altogether. It possesses enormous resource depth, oil reserves, critical minerals, uranium, nickel, cobalt, rare earth elements. These are not side notes. These are the ingredients of industrial resilience, military production, energy transition, and long-term strategic autonomy. In a world reorganizing around supply chains and national security, that resource base is not a footnote to geopolitics. It is geopolitics.so. When Canada signals that it is willing to expand cooperation outward, it is not doing so from weakness alone. It is doing so with assets others need. That is what makes this moment so important. The old assumption that America would remain the unquestioned, dependable core of the Western system has not disappeared completely, but it has been damaged, stretched, tested, in the eyes of some allies, perhaps broken. And once that assumption breaks, countries do what countries always do. They diversify risk. For Canada, that means a difficult balancing act. Maintain NORAD because it still matters. Avoid reckless rupture because the US remains too powerful and too close to ignore. But at the same time, quietly build alternate routes, alternate partnerships, alternate capabilities, and alternate leverage. Build enough redundancy that one country's unpredictability does not become your national vulnerability. For NATO more broadly, the lesson is even harsher. The United States may still be indispensable in many areas, but indispensable is no longer the same thing as exclusive. That is the shift. And once allies internalize that, the architecture of the West begins to change, whether Washington likes it or not. So the question now is not whether Canada is making new friends. Of course it is. The deeper question is whether those friendships are being turned into a contingency plan for a future in which American reliability cannot be taken for granted. That is the unsettling possibility hanging over all of this. Because if there is one message echoing out of the Norwegian Arctic, out of the military exercises, out of the procurement decisions, out of the infrastructure investments, and out of the calm, data-heavy political pushback we saw from Canadian leadership, it is this: Canada is no longer standing still and hoping stability returns on its own. It is repositioning. It is preparing. It is widening its options. And in a world where one of the most powerful alliances on Earth can show visible cracks across one of its most sensitive frontiers, that may not be overreaction. It may be the only sober response available. So now the decision falls to the audience watching all of this unfold. Is Canada simply modernizing its alliances for a more complicated century? Or is it quietly preparing for the possibility that one day it may need to protect its interests without being able to rely on the United States the way it once did? That is the real question. And if current events are any indication, it is no longer a fringe question. It is rapidly becoming the central strategic question of the Arctic era. If you want, I can do 2 more versions of this next.